So our text then is Romans 1, verses 18 and 19. Just read those two verses over one more time. God, through the Apostle Paul, has these words for us then this afternoon. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. After the sermon, we hope to respond by singing from hymn 70, Day of Judgment, Day of Wonder, following this sermon. Congregation of the Lord Jesus Christ, brothers and sisters, it's not uncommon for us as Christians to be a bit on the shy side when it comes to talking about our faith. And maybe that's a bit of our Canadian culture. Heard it said that there's two things that you never talk about with a stranger, and that's politics and religion. And so you just tends to be one of those conversations that gets avoided pretty easily. Just in, say, the grocery store, or if you are walking alongside someone in the park or something like that. That is if you even get to talk with somebody if they're not on their phone. But regardless, I have it actually as a pastor as almost an easy in when it comes to meeting people, just because, well, once they ask one of the things you are allowed to talk about, which is, what do you do? Then I say I'm a pastor, and I have an easy in to talk about what about you? Is there anything going on in your spiritual life? Where's your spiritual health at? But if I didn't have that, I'm pretty sure it would not be that easy to bring it up. It would be a lot easier to just avoid anything to do with the topic. It would actually seem to almost come across as aggressive or maybe overly pious if you bring it up directly. Maybe you get called a Bible thumper or something like that once you leave. What if people make fun of us or get angry with us? There's a lot of reasons that we can come up with not to speak about Christianity. Now, I bring that all up because one of the more famous verses in the Bible is in Romans chapter 1. It's not part of our text. It comes right before it, Romans 1, verse 16, where Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. Now, Paul's writing this to a church that is far away in Rome, and he's never been to this church before. He's excited to try go there. He's tried to go in the past. But the reason he wants to go is that he's eager to preach the gospel to them, the good news about Jesus Christ. And, well, if you're Paul, he's eager, he says, to be mutually encouraged, verse 12, by the faith of the Romans, and also to, in that sense, encourage them in their faith. But he also is hoping to reap a harvest there among the rest of the Gentiles. That's verse 13. In other words, he wants to also talk to other people that haven't heard the faith there and see if he can reap a harvest as well, because that's his calling. He's called to be an apostle to the Gentiles. He refers to himself as that more often. Now, if you're Paul, not everyone wants to hear this gospel. Especially if you've read through the book of Acts, you realize that it's not exactly like Paul leaves behind him a nice, flourishing city and everyone is super happy and at peace. No, wherever Paul goes, yes, there are people who believe, but there are also people who get right upset. There are riots. There are people that are trying to arrest him, whip him, kill him. He's at one point stoned, and it looks like he's dead. He's a controversial figure. And yet, it's almost in that kind of background that he writes to them. Perhaps they know something of where he's been and what he does. He writes in verse 16, sorry, I'm still not ashamed of my gospel. I still am going to go and proclaim it. I still want to go to Rome. Even if it might cause a stir, people need to hear it. It's not something I'm going to keep hidden. And now chapter 3 and chapter 4, they go into detail as to what this gospel is. But before Paul goes into that gospel, he starts talking about the reason why he's eager to bring it and why he's not ashamed of it. And it's even captured in verses 18 and 19 that this is the gospel that the world needs. We're going to look at how much the world needs it, but there will also be an opportunity for us to think about our own eagerness to know this gospel and also bring it to people in the world that need it. So the theme, it's the gospel of faith that the world needs. We'll look at what the world knows, first of all, and then secondly, what the world does, and thirdly, what the world gets. And in terms of our text, we'll actually be kind of working backwards through the text. We'll start in verse 19 and work our way up to the beginning of verse 18. So verse 19, then, to start with, says, "What can be known about God is plain to the world." It's plain to mankind, because God has shown it to them. Paul claims that everyone in the world, in their heart of hearts, knows about God. Whether they admit it or not isn't really his point. They know him, he says. God has shown them who he is. And that's what Paul goes on to explain in verse 20. Humans, he says, can clearly see, have always been able to clearly perceive things about God, invisible attributes, he calls them. And then he names them out, two things: eternal power and divine nature. Eternal power and divine nature. If you think about it, let's take the first one, eternal power. He's saying everyone can see God's eternal power just by living. How does that work? Well, I imagine you can understand it when you, say, go outside on a clear night in the summer and the stars are all shining and the vastness of it all, the sun and its power on a nice, clear, sunny day. You see just how powerful it is, how small you are. Or maybe in the middle of a thunderstorm where the wind is howling over huge oaks and maples, trees are shuddering, the rain and the thunder and the lightning. Psalm 104, we sang at the beginning, it talks about God's power over creation, how he can shatter things. Psalm 29 says that his voice in creation does that kind of thing. It's an immense amount of power that lies in this creation. Now you could say, well, that doesn't mean you have to say God exists from that. What causes that power? When an earthquake shakes or a flood shows the power of water to be able to just bowl over things and ruin cities? Well, what caused it? Science can track the continental plates and melting icebergs or certain storms and weather patterns that led to the flood. That's not really why I'm bringing this up. That's not what Paul's getting at either. I don't want to get too philosophical on you, but this is really a question that philosophers before Paul's day wrestled with, struggled with, like Plato and Aristotle. If there is all this power in this world, things moving and being moved, then just knowing the rules of cause and effect, knowing that for something to move, it has to be moved, to have energy, it has to gain energy from something else in order to move. Well, where did that movement start from? What is the first thing that caused movement? And really, the Big Bang Theory doesn't answer that, because what started the Big Bang? What changed? What motion put the Big Bang into effect? Where did any motion come from? The only answer is that there is something, or better yet, someone who is behind it all with eternal power. Power that has been from the beginning and can just be around forever. Creation, really, if you just look around, it demands that there be some sort of powerful being behind all the power that's going on. And the philosophers, even the Greek philosophers admitted that. Aristotle called it the prime mover, the first one to move things, or the first cause. And he said it has to be something that's different than all the things in this world. It has to be something eternal. Otherwise, you just have to keep going back until you get something like that. It's just logic. So that in a sense, is part of what Paul says people can just see in this world. God's eternal power that has started before the creation of this world. That's the first one. The second one is divine nature. I think we can connect this with what is often known as the argument from intelligent design, because divine nature is just, we can tell it by God's being godness, his deity, which is his being over and above this creation and being able to create it and design it. And the argument from intelligent design basically says, well, because there are natural things in this world that are complex and have certain functions and purposes built into them, like the cells of the human body or the abilities of many animals to do exactly the things they need to do in order to find food or survive, these are things that they don't just fall into place over time, all in a balance. That would be like if you dropped a spring and a piece of wood and a couple pieces of steel together 1 billion times, it's still not going to fall into a mousetrap. A mousetrap is designed, it needs to be physically put together in order for that all to work together in the same way, for the trap to be set. And since there are many natural things in this world that have way more complexity than a mousetrap, there has to be something or someone who designed it, who put it all together at one time. Some higher nature, some divine nature. And there are more arguments that could be made along these kind of logical lines. There was a philosopher, a medieval philosopher, a Roman Catholic philosopher, Thomas Aquinas. There are schools named after him in the area, I believe. Probably Hamilton, I think. Either way, he was a renowned scholastic philosopher, they call him, and he had 5 arguments for the existence of God that still get carried on today. A lot of them connect with the same argument or the same characteristics as what Paul is talking about here. God's eternal power and divine nature. They're clearly seen. It just logically makes sense that you look around this world and you think there has to be an eternal power. Now, this is just, in that sense, innate to our human minds. Maybe we don't draw it out logically like St. Thomas Aquinas did, where he would have, A statement and B statement, and therefore C proved it, God exists. We probably don't draw it up like that in our own minds, but just go through the different cultures throughout history, and over again, you find this desire to worship a higher being, or to at least explain how the world came to be. It's just human to see this creation and start thinking in that way. Which is why something like Psalm 19 can say, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The sky above proclaims his handiwork." Creation displays him. Day to day pour forth speech, night to night reveals knowledge. Or think of Paul's words. He says something similar in Acts 14, where he says that God did not leave himself without witness. People in the world who hadn't specifically heard of him before in those Greek cities, they still knew about him because God left a witness in the way that he cared over creation, in the way that he had eternal power. And that speaks, as Paul will go on to say, to God's fairness, because it leaves men without excuse. He makes sure, God does, that every being knows that there is a being that deserves great honor and thanks for creating this world. That should be innate to us. But it also speaks to the fact that also means the world should be doing something, should be reacting. And that's where the next problem arises. What the world knows is that God exists and that he deserves honor. What the world does is a different thing. That's our second point. Move back up in the text to the second half of verse 18, although the first little bit does talk about ungodliness and unrighteousness. That's what men do. They don't do righteous things. They don't thank God. They don't honor him. And what do? He says it at the end of verse 18, by their unrighteousness, they suppress the truth. They suppress the truth. Paul might come up to somebody that says, I don't believe in God. He might come up to an atheist, perhaps, maybe in Athens or something like that, who say, there's no God. And what would Paul do when he would come up to an atheist like that? He said, you're fooling yourself. You're literally fooling yourself. You are suppressing a truth that you know in your heart of hearts is true. And he goes on to explain how that works. It's a process over time. God shows people that he exists, that he deserves to be honored, but then they start saying, I don't want to do that. They start pushing that truth away from them, covering it up, trying to look the other way, pretend they don't hear it, they don't see it, because that would require them to then respond with thanks, with honor, with all kinds of different things. In verses 21 through 23 of this chapter, they go so far as to say that in place of God, while they're suppressing the truth about God, they actually start replacing God with other things, with things from creation, and they start giving those things from creation glory instead. It's called idol making. Ancient cultures have done that for a while. Think of all the gods people have come up with, the idols that they worship. Some of them are animals, some of them are humans, but they're all things that were created. All things that are part of this creation. Egypt had a dog and an eagle as their gods. Others had cows and lions. Other gods were, like I said, human, but with special powers, like Baal, who was a god of thunder. He was represented holding a rod of lightning. And Zeus of the Greeks was very similar, Jupiter of the Romans as well. But the point being, no matter what god you look at from drawings or idols that were made, the one thing that they always have in common is that they're based off of something in this creation. Not only is that suppressing the truth about God, it's patently foolish. These are created things. These are limited things. Rather than worshiping the Creator, the Divine One, the one who is different and superior, who created, they're worshiping his project. That would be like taking Mozart's piano and saying, wow, what a nice piano that is. What a sonata it just played. I can't believe that sound came out of you, piano. Well done. How great is this piano? It doesn't make any sense. Mozart is the one that made the piano do those wonderful things. And modern day idols have the same issues. They're all part of this creation, whether it's the money that we operate with, whether it's sexual desires that we have as created beings, whether it's power that we can gain while being in relationship with other people, trying to go after power, luxuries and pleasures and entertainment and sports and vacations, or things that are good in and of themselves, but we can make them so big that they replace God for us. Just comfort and security, safety, our own families and wanting them to get along with them. And on you can go. They only become idols because they become idols because we see this creation and we start suppressing the truth about the Creator, who has something so much greater in terms of what he deserves in terms of worship. And yet we ignore that and we just worship the slightly good things that we see in this creation. And as human beings, we're all worshipers. We all worship something. And sin is literally just missing the mark on what we aim our worship at. And Romans 1 is saying it's our own foolish fault. We were, verse 20, without excuse. We miss the one that is easiest to worship because he's so deserving of that worship. And he made all these excellent things, and we start just going after the things themselves. And foolishness, that's exactly what sin is. It's incredible how foolish sin can be, and yet how powerful. And and we struggle with the temptation, and then afterwards we sit back after we fall into that temptation and we say, how could I? How foolish I was. It was so obvious I shouldn't be doing that, and yet I just did it. And was it worth it? No. The damage I did? Completely not worth it. But the desire just overwhelmed us, and yet it's just foolish. But this is what we now do as the world. We suppress the truth, we suppress what we know is right, and we start worshiping and prioritizing other things. But there's more of what the world does. In fact, much of the rest of the chapter describes the ungodliness, the unrighteousness that men have been doing once they started to suppress the truth. It's basically a spiral out of control, worse and worse. Verses 24 and 25 mention the dishonoring of our bodies, lusts, making an idol of sexual pleasure. That leads into verses 26 and 27, where there are unnatural relations of men with men, women with women, described as contrary to nature. It's one of the clearest passages that you just can't get out of when it comes to the New Testament's teaching on God not condoning same-sex relationships, but seeing them as against nature. Though I would also point out that within this chapter, this list, it isn't listed as the worst possible thing that people could do. It's more just the result of many people following their own feelings and desires rather than following God's plan for their lives. But then that leads into verses 28 to the end of the chapter, which is really the result of this spiraling out of control. They're filled with, verse 29, all manner of unrighteousness, and then the list just comes at you. Evil, covetousness, malice, envy, over and over again, a huge list of all the different evil things that people do, including disobeying their parents, being heartless, hating God. But the kicker is the final verse. The final verse of Romans 1. They know, here's them knowing again, they know God's righteous decree that deserves death, but they not only do them, they start giving approval. They start rejoicing in. They start cheering on evil. Somebody's rebelling against their parents, and they think it's hilarious. Somebody's hating God and trying to come up with ways to put down Christians, and everyone's laughing. Mocking those that have a conscience and think that any of these things listed here are wrong. This is what happens among human beings with the sinful nature that we have. This is the unrighteousness and ungodliness that's all over the world when people turn away from God. It's what happens when cultures and societies forget about the fact that there is a creator who has a moral standard that we ought to be following. Evil becomes good. Wrong becomes right. What is shameful becomes something to rejoice in and laugh at. It sounds somewhat similar, actually, to what George Orwell described as the motto of the totalitarian society in his book 1984. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. It's all backwards. There's no truth. There's no standard. To lose God is really to lose light, to fall into darkness and walk blindly. And the result of all that is our third point, what the world gets. Working backward through our text, we come to the very beginning of verse 18, where it simply says, the wrath of God is revealed. God's anger, his just hatred for sin comes out. The world gets God's wrath. They're without excuse. They know. They choose to ignore. They dive headlong into sin, so God has every right to get angry for the ruining of his creation and the foolishness that's going on in this world. And what does that look like, God's anger? Well, if you look carefully, actually, we went through the passage, but at the beginning of every section that we have, at least in the ESV with the paragraphs, you can see it say that God is actually involved in this spiraling out of control that's going on. Verse 24, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity. Verse 26, for this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. And verse 28, since they didn't see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind. God gave them up, God gave them up, God gave them up. It's all the revealing of God's wrath. His wrath, his mode of anger is just, you can almost say, just let them go. Don't stop them from spiraling out of control. The world can get what they want. Let them just feast on their own desires. Let them just follow their feelings wherever those feelings will go without any standards. And that is, in fact, part of God's wrath, part of his punishment. It actually reminded me of a C.S. Lewis quote that must have come from these kinds of verses from Romans chapter 1. He says, there are only two kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says in the end, thy will be done. His conclusion is, all that are in hell choose it. And that really is what Romans 1 is saying about God in wrath. Basically, he's saying, go ahead, be the fool, see what happens. You'll get what you'll get. And that is the sad reality of sin. If God doesn't restrain it, we just go full bore into it. It's the reality of sin that this world has been wrestling with ever since Adam and Eve fell. Something similar was going on in Genesis 6 already, right after the fall into sin. You read beginning of Genesis 6, before Noah's ark. It says, God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. It's about as bad as you can get. I think the author ran out of words as to how bad it could get. That's really our world getting what it wants, getting the pleasures we ask for that lead to a backwards, blind, broken world where right and wrong, love and hate, all sorts of opposites get confused. That's Genesis 6. That's Paul's day. That's today. That is what life has always been like, wherever there are people not honoring God, which it's happened ever since Adam and Eve fell into sin. God can choose to let them go. Not the most joyful start to a letter, perhaps, but we shouldn't miss the warning here that this is what happens when the devil gets a foothold, when sin makes a home in anybody's heart. There's that danger there. And yet Romans 1, if you noticed, it was not always this solemn and dire. Verses 16 and 17, we started with the fact that Paul wasn't ashamed of this gospel. Paul had just been declaring how he's excited. He can't wait to get to Rome and this place where he's never been and speak about Jesus Christ, speak about the righteousness of God that is being revealed from faith for faith. Again, it may have been pretty controversial, but he is not ashamed because, why is he not ashamed? Because as much as God's wrath is being revealed, it's being made obvious against all the evil that's going on in this world, their ungodliness, their unrighteousness, all the list of things that the rest of Romans 1 goes on to speak about. In Paul's gospel, in opposition to that unrighteousness, God's righteousness is being revealed. A gospel that you can take hold of by faith. It's centered on faith. Paul is excited because even though there are all kinds of unrighteous people, ungodly people, and even in our own hearts there are all kinds of difficulties and struggles and people spiraling into sin, that doesn't mean that there's no hope. Instead, all of that sin and struggle just serves to shine a spotlight on the need for outside help, the need for outside godliness, outside righteousness to come in and take over. Something that can begin transforming this out-of-control world. And Paul is saying, my gospel may be controversial. Jews might not like what I have to say because some of them didn't expect it, and they didn't expect a person crucified on a cross. And they didn't expect somebody that claimed to be divine. And Greeks might not like it because they may not like the way that this takes over their empire, and the Romans with their empire. But there's no way I'm going to be ashamed about this gospel when it is what this world so desperately needs. This is the cure for what ails the world. The gospel of grace, where we don't have to compete against each other in order to please God, where we can rest in the work of Jesus Christ. He'll go into that in more detail in chapter 3, but he's like, at this point, he's like a doctor with medicine that flies into a place where people really need that medicine, but they're suspicious of him because he's from another place. That doctor's not going to just hide away and be like, well, we'll wait until they might welcome me a little bit better. No, he's going to try as much as he can to show them the help that he has, the medicine that he has that can cure them of their illness. Paul knows what this world needs, and he wants to bring it. That's Paul in Romans 1. And how much more then should we not be ashamed of the gospel of faith when we know that this is still what the world around us needs today as well? It's still just as life-saving. It's still just as essential. It's still just what this world needs as it was in Paul's day. How could we then cover it up? How could we then be nervous about how we might come across when this is life to spiritual souls that are about to die? This is the medicine that can cure. This gospel points people in the direction of dependence on God and no dependence on themselves and their own feelings and their own will and their own abilities. It's the gospel of faith in Jesus Christ that everyone can find relief and peace in. If that message is held back, what this world will get is, well, what it wanted to get, but it's complete destruction and hell. There's no way around it. That's where God's wrath leads in the end. If you truly believe what the Scripture says about what is coming, then you will lay down your life to make sure that all hear the offer of the forgiveness of sins and grace in Jesus Christ. Because everyone will do that because that's what Jesus Christ did for you. He didn't care about the shame. He didn't care about the mockery. He didn't care about the pain and the humiliation and the whippings and the torture of the cross. He went and basically humiliated himself with his death on the cross. There was nothing more humiliating than a death on the cross. Conquered, defeated, looking shameful to the whole world, rejected by the earth, and still as well rejected by heaven too. But Jesus Christ did all of that so that you could get the medicine that you so desperately needed, so that you could get this gospel. How great a Savior. Judgment Day is a great and terrible thing. We have to be honest, it is coming. But of course, for those who are in Christ, we trust, this is Paul's gospel, that he will say to them, to us, "Come near, you blessed. See the kingdom I bestow. You forever shall my love and glory know." Amen.